Now we're going to continue today with Leviticus chapter 19. And if there's one single principle of God that the entire world is violated, and that is the greatest single cause outside of just sin itself, for this global chaos that we watch on the evening news or we read about in our newspapers or we even experience it in our own lives in some way or another, it's the one that we began to discuss last time, and we're going to take it up again today. This principle is at the heart of all that God is, and it reflects his nature. And therefore, to violate it is to reject harmony with it. The spiritual law I'm speaking of is that of dividing, electing, and separating. And expressed in the negative, the law is that those who love the Lord are not to improperly mix things that are set aside for life with things that are destined for destruction. We're not to cross God-erected boundaries and mix two things that, while each might well be good and acceptable of themselves, they're to be kept separated. They're not to be combined. We are not to mix the holy with the unholy. We're not even to mix the holy with the common, the clean with the unclean. Further, we're not to redesignate things that God calls evil as good or vice versa. We're not to replace God's laws with theological philosophies. They're called doctrines. To do any of these things is to create, God says, tevel, confusion. And confusion is completely at odds with the Lord's attributes of wholeness and order. And confusion is the state of the whole world today, isn't it? The cause of it is improper mixing at all kinds of levels. So let's refresh our memories by rereading a portion of Leviticus chapter 19. We'll start reading at verse 19 and go on to the end. That's page 132 if you have a complete Jewish Bible. So we're going to read Leviticus 19, starting with verse 19. Observe my regulations. Don't let your livestock mate with those of another kind. Don't sow your field with two kinds of grain. Don't wear a garment of cloth made with two different kinds of thread. If a man has sexual relations with a woman who is a slave intended for another man, and she has neither been redeemed nor given her freedom, there is to be an investigation. They're not to be put to death because she wasn't free. In reparation, he's to bring a ram as a guilt offering for himself to the entrance of the tent of meeting. The Cohen, the priest, will make atonement for him with the ram of the guilt offering before Adonai for the sin he's committed, and he will be forgiven for the sin he's committed. And when you enter the land and you plant various kinds of fruit trees, you're to regard its fruit as forbidden. For 3 years it will be forbidden to you and not eaten. In the 4th year, all its fruit will be holy for praising Adonai. But in the 5th year, you may eat its fruit, so that it will produce even more for you. I am Adonai your God. Don't eat anything with blood. Don't practice divination or fortune-telling. Don't round your hair at the temples or mar the edges of your beard. Don't cut gashes in your flesh when someone dies or tattoo yourselves, I am Adonai. Don't debase your daughter by making her a prostitute so that the land won't fall into prostitution and become full of shame. Keep my Sabbaths. Revere my sanctuary. I'm Adonai. Do not turn to spirit mediums or sorcerers. Don't seek them out to be defiled by them. I'm Adonai your God. Stand up in the presence of a person with gray hair. Show respect for the old. You are to fear your God. I am Adonai. If a foreigner stays with you in your land, do not do him wrong. Treat the foreigner staying with you like the native born among you. You're to love him as you love yourself. For you were foreigners in the land of Egypt. I'm Adonai your God. Don't be dishonest when measuring length, weight, or capacity. Rather, use an honest balance scale, honest weights, an honest bushel dry measure, an honest gallon liquid measure. I'm Adonai, your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Observe all of my regulations and rulings and do them, for I am Adonai. The Hebrew word for this improper mixing of things, the crossing of God's boundaries, is called kilayim. Kilayim. And there have been profound writings by the ancient Hebrew sages on the subject, as well as a lot of fanciful allegory. Kilayim, improper mixing, results in tevel, confusion. Now, Leviticus 19:19 is, of course, not the only place in the Torah where specific edicts against kilayim is mandated. Deuteronomy 22 also adds, in some cases it just kind of repeats, more examples of improper mixing which results in tevel. That is, kilayim, improper mixing, always results in confusion. Here are a couple of examples. Deuteronomy 22:5. A woman shall not wear man's clothing, nor shall a man put on woman's clothing. For whoever does these things is an abomination to the Lord your God. Deuteronomy 22:9. You shall not sow your vineyard with two kinds of seed, lest all the produce of the seed which you have sown and the increase of the vineyard become defiled. You shall not plow with an ox and a donkey together. You shall not wear a material mixed of wool and linen together. I'd like to share with you the general understanding among the Hebrew sages of the underlying principles and problems from improper mixing, kilayim. To begin with, there are three types of mixing or hybridization spoken of between Leviticus 19 and Deuteronomy 22. First is the kind represented by sowing grain in a vineyard. This is generally what is meant by not sowing two types of seed together. This is considered the most extreme example. It produces the most serious results. When two species of plants are planted in super close proximity to one another, the result is that the roots can become enmeshed. Each derives some part of its source of nourishment from the other. It's not that the grape is going to start to look like barley, not that the barley is going to turn into the color of ripening grapes. The outward physical characteristics don't necessarily change. However, several of the internal attributes change. Taste, texture, aroma, a host of other changes can occur as a result of crossing over this boundary. As far as a category or class of kilayim to too closely to plants arising from two kinds of seed sown together, this is considered to be the same as interbreeding two different kinds or two different species of behama, domesticated land animals. Now, the second category that the ancient sages delineated is represented by the prohibition against harnessing an ox and a donkey together, ostensibly to pull a cart or a plow. That is, the yoking together of two inherently different creatures for the purpose of using them to perform some kind of work. Now, here the hybridization is not in any kind of a biological mixing, not an organic mixing, but it's in their action, it's in their purpose and in their function. The problem is in using two different species, each designed for different purposes, for some kind of common work, presumably work that is suitable for the one, but it's not for the other. So it's not that the attributes of either species is somehow altered or the one's a good species and the other is a bad species. It is that the function each was created to perform got altered due to this improper mixing by men. The third category, illustrated by the wearing of clothing made of a mixture of wool and linen, is kind of that middle ground between those first two categories I spoke about. Even though on the one hand, the two fibers, wool and linen, come from entirely different sources, they shouldn't be woven together to produce something of a singular purpose. An important feature to note of each of these cases is that there is nothing inherently evil or unclean or abnormal about any of these species of plants or animals that individually would make any of them taboo. It's when God-ordained boundaries are crossed and the two separate species are combined that the problem arises. And as when we discussed clean and unclean, and we found that clean animals weren't inherently better, they weren't more godly or more normal as compared to unclean animals, so it is with these forbidden mixtures. Linen and wool woven together don't necessarily produce a physically inferior cloth as compared to pure linen or that makes a pure cloth. And in fact, depending on one's taste, a wine made of certain grapes produced by having a certain variety of wheat or barley grown underneath them and alongside the grapevine might actually be desirable. Rather, it's simply God's sovereign decision as to what improper mixing is. We can search for why for these choices all day long. I promise you that the answers are going to wind up being allegorical in nature. We're going to have to make them up. Generally, it's going to be a pure guess. Because in most cases, he doesn't tell us why. That just bugs the living daylights out of human beings, doesn't it? Why, God? Why? So we continue out the search for why. That leads to men then deciding that if they can find no rational, logical why, then there's no longer any reason to obey that commandment. Kind of reminds us when our children were young. Why, Daddy? Why? And you know, you could explain it 10 times, and they're not going to get it. Because the why just means, but I want to anyway. That's all that is. We see that reasoning in our era, particularly as concerns homosexuality and gay marriage. The question usually posed is, what harm could it cause? It's not like they can reproduce. What two people do in private is his or her business. Besides, that was just an ancient taboo obeyed by an ignorant, primitive people. It has no place in our modern world. If it were only the secular world arguing for that point of view, I guess I wouldn't much worry about it. I guess that would be expected. But sadly, more and more within the church, that stance has been adopted. Some cases, it has become actual, codified church doctrine. Recall the great hand-wringing within the church over the selection of a Catholic pope a few years ago because he stated he was staunchly anti-gay marriage and anti-abortion. This caused a worldwide upheaval, seems like. See, the church is in a complete quandary on how to react to all this because it has so mixed itself with the ways of the world and decided that the old laws of the Old Testament are dead and gone, and with it the morality that it governed over us, that we don't know what to do. My advice to you is, first of all, abandon your search for why. Just get rid of it. Instead, focus on discovering the patterns. Discover the patterns. How one pattern intertwines with the next. Then your understanding of who God is, how he operates, what he expects of us is going to be increased, and your frustration and all your doubts will decrease. Now, before we continue with more commandments in Leviticus 19, let me end our discussion on improper mixing that results in confusion. In Hebrew, kilayim, that results in tevel. I want to show you something in the New Testament that's a prime example of kilayim in action. And it is in a statement of St. Paul that is one of the most quoted yet most misunderstood. It's found in 2 Corinthians 6:14. Be ye not unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness, and what communion hath light with darkness? We've heard that one 100 times. Paul wasn't making up a new theology. He was simply stating the Torah principle that we've been talking about. The Torah principle of kilayim, no improper mixing. Actually, he was referring directly to Deuteronomy 22:10, where it says that an ox and a donkey shouldn't be brought into union to pull a plow. Here in 2 Corinthians, righteousness shouldn't be mixed with unrighteousness. Light should not be mixed with darkness. And here's the thing. Paul was doing what Jesus did, and what we should do is we seek to reapply as opposed to reinterpret the Torah for our age. Paul takes a commandment, do not unequally yoke an ox and a donkey, and he takes it from the purely physical earthbound realm up into the spiritual heavenly realm that it was always intended to proclaim. Just how is that so? Because Paul equates the principle of unequal yoking of physical things like donkeys and oxen to the unequal yoking of spiritual things like righteousness and unrighteousness. For the believer, just as for the Hebrew, there is a strictly defined boundary established by God between righteousness and unrighteousness, light and dark. And remember, light and darkness, as we saw in Genesis, or and choshech, are spiritual in their essences. And neither the physical nor the spiritual boundaries are to be blurred, and they're certainly not to be crossed. Or kilayim, improperly mixed. That is the meaning of be ye not unequally yoked. In modern thought, it means don't be improperly mixed. Now let's move on to verse 20. Now I hope you're all beginning to get used to hearing all this sometimes unexpected, frank and explicit talk about sexual relations in the Torah, because we're going to encounter it again and again. Verses 20 through 22 are all one thought. It's about the same situation, and since it has ascended to the lofty status of being one of the 613 laws of Torah, we're going to probably assume that the scenario presented in these 3 verses did happen with some regularity. It wasn't hypothetical. Let's take a closer look, because this story gives us an interesting aspect of Hebrew society in the 14th century BC. The gravity of this situation is kind of obscured because of the differences between Hebrew culture in that time and modern Western culture today. So I want to explain to you what's happening. These verses ordain that a man is not to have sexual relations with a slave girl if she has been previously promised to another man. So here's the deal. In this case, the slave girl is a Hebrew girl owned by a Hebrew man. Most of the slave girls owned by Israelites were, in fact, Israelite girls. Why would this be so? The ordinance of Exodus 21, 7 through 11, makes it perfectly lawful for a father to sell his daughter into what we would call today bond servitude. Listen to Exodus 21. And if a man sells his daughter as a female slave, she is not to go free as the male slaves do. If she is displeasing in the eyes of her master, who designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. He does not have authority to sell her to a foreign people because of unfairness to her. And if he designates her for his son, he shall deal with her according to the custom of daughters. If he takes to himself another woman, he may not reduce her food or her clothing or her conjugal rights. And if he will not do these things for her, then she shall go out for nothing without payment of money. Now, the selling of this young Israelite girl by her father to an Israelite man was usually the result of that family being stricken with poverty, or the family being in debt and the girl was the payment. Now, we should not draw a mental picture of some poor girl in chains and tied to a stake each evening so that she doesn't run away. We should not think of a girl who's mistreated or starved or beaten or used as an object of sexual pleasure by the man who now owns her. The law insists she must be well treated. So here we have the case of a young Hebrew girl, a child by our standards actually, sold to a Hebrew man. When the girl matured, she gets to the marrying age, generally about 15 years old, a little bit more. The man who owns her has an obligation to either marry her himself, give her to his son in marriage, or allow her to be redeemed. Now, this particular kind of redemption usually meant that if a man who was looking for a wife wanted to marry this slave girl, the slave owner was required to give her to him, but at a price, a redemption price. The procedure was that the interested man would bargain with the slave owner over the redemption price. Once agreed to, the girl was now legally designated to her future husband. And a period of time would pass, though, before the future husband brought that redemption money to the slave owner. And during all that time, the slave girl continued to live with the slave owner as though she had been sold. It was kind of the ancient Hebrew version of the layaway plan. But she remained an unmarried girl and a slave. Now, if a different man, came along and seduced that girl, now there's a problem. The problem was the girl was damaged goods. The future husband was expecting a virgin, but since she's no longer a virgin, there's no way her future husband would have accepted her. He would cancel the marriage, call the whole deal off. This means the girl's owner is out all that money he'd been expecting. The end of verse 20 says that as a result of this, there shall be an indemnity. Don't go looking blind in your Bibles for this word because it's not there. Instead, like in my Complete Jewish Bible, your Bibles are going to say punishment or inquiry or inquisition or something like that. Hebrew scholars have looked on that translation with suspicion for centuries. Within the Hebrew cultural context of that era, none of those words makes any sense in the situation that's being described. Over the last few years, as the study of language cognates pertaining to Hebrew has progressed, the true meaning of many odd and really rare, what it really is, Hebrew words has come into better focus. And a cognate simply means that a word in one language is closely related to a word in another language. So if one can be certain of the meaning of a word in an older and related language, that meaning can generally be transferred to its cognate in its sister language. And we have that exact situation here. The Hebrew word in question appears here, and here alone in the entire Bible. But a cognate has been discovered. The Hebrew word that's typically been translated as punishment or inquiry is bikret. Bikret. And what language experts now know is that many Hebrew words are taken from the Akkadian language. And in Akkadian, we find the word bakru. And bakru means to make good on a claim. That is, to indemnify. Indemnity is a word most Floridians are pretty familiar with because of our frequent hurricanes. Because it pertains to homeowners insurance. In legalese, a person who buys an insurance policy is now indemnified against certain risks. It's now generally agreed, as I said, that bikret is a Hebrew cognate of the Akkadian word bakru. So the idea that's being expressed here in our story is that the man who seduced this slave girl who had been promised to another man was now responsible to pay the full agreed to price that had been negotiated between the slave owner and that future husband who was now pulled out of the deal. The slave owner would have confronted the seducer, made his claim, and demanded reparations. Now, it's interesting to note that it wasn't so much that it was the future husband that was wronged. It was the slave owner who was wronged, because he would have been out the money promised for the girl that he owned. Therefore, the seducer had to pay reparations not to the promised husband, but to the slave owner. How about the future husband? Man, he's just out of luck. No girl, no money, no nothing. The future husband lost a fiancée, meaning he'd have to go to all the trouble now to find another one. End of story. But that wasn't the end of the story for the guy who seduced the girl, who was already promised to another man. According to verse 21, the seducer, in addition, had to make a sacrifice at the altar. Specifically, had to make what's called an Ashen sacrifice, a reparation offering, at the tabernacle. For not only had he committed an indiscretion that damaged and devalued the property of the slave owner, he trespassed against God by violating a commandment. And because an Ashen was established in order to make atonement for committing a sinful act, it was usually pretty expensive. So the seducer paid quite a price for his lust. And by the way, notice he still doesn't get the girl. I imagine he could, but now, after he's paid all this reparation to the slave owner for a very expensive sacrifice, now he has to go to the slave owner and negotiate a bride price. That's all above that, because the money he paid to the slave owner was a penalty. It wasn't a purchase price. Well, as we move on to verse 23, we get another of those laws that won't take effect for a little while because it involves farming. That's something that wouldn't take place until the Israelites settled in Canaan. And the law is that when Israel plants fruit trees, and in the Bible this really means any kind of a tree that bears something edible, nuts, dates, olives, oranges, it doesn't matter, that for the first 3 years, none of the tree's produce is to be eaten. I'm not going to go too deeply into detail here. But when one takes the original Hebrew literally, the idea is not so much about a prohibition against picking and eating the fruit, but instead destroying it. Rather, it is about trimming or pruning the tree. In other words, because of the pruning that's necessary to get the tree to mature and to be productive, the fruit is going to be lost during the pruning process. So, for the first 3 years, these young branches are to be heavily pruned, and the fruit that might otherwise have grown will be lost, apparently so the trees will be better producers in the long run. Now, then in the 4th year, a good harvest can be expected. But that entire first legal harvest of fruit has to be set apart for praising God. In other words, in the 4th year, the harvest is considered holy, which means sanctified, which means set apart to God. So it's all given to Him. What this amounted to was that it was in some undefined way offered to God in a celebration and assuredly eaten during this time of celebration, but probably eaten only by the Levites and the priests. The fruit of the 4th years was consecrated. It was holy property. It belonged to God. That meant that some of it was burned up and the remaining holy portion went to the priesthood. But then in the 5th year, normal harvesting could commence. Now, what's the purpose of this 5-year progressive procedure? We're told in verse 25, it's so that the yield of the tree harvest will increase. And this is seen as another of those reality of duality situations. That is, there was a horticultural reality in that by allowing the trees to grow and being pruned without harvesting their fruit for the first 3 years, the trees would become better producers over their lifetime. On the other hand, from a spiritual standpoint, by being obedient to this commandment of God, Jehovah would see to it that the yield was supernaturally increased as a blessing for being obedient. But as the increase of the harvest was not the only aspect to be blessed, shalom, we're told, was also increased. Shalom, when taken as an overall state of well-being, having joy, peace, health, grace from the Lord, it's something only God can give. The pagan Canaanites and the God-fearing Israelites might each receive a similar amount of fruit from following this practice of pruning and not harvesting until the 4th year. But only the one who loves God can receive shalom. And that's the greatest blessing of them all, by far. Now, someone recently asked a great question, or perhaps is less a question and more the expression of a thought. In that, can we say that those who love and obey God will reap reward, earthly reward, while those who do not will not? Now, without doubt, the scriptures make it clear that those who follow Torah, who obey God, and who make Yeshua the Lord of their lives is going to see an increase in the fruit of their lives as a blessing. And for those who don't, blessing will be withheld. So it is advantageous for us to be obedient to God, that even in our earthly lives, we will be blessed with better lives. But that concept can also be easily misunderstood. For instance, if the Canaanites who would remain in the land after Israel conquered it watched what the Israelites did with their fruit trees and they emulated it, that is, they saw by following those practices, we just discussed, the trees would become more abundant and better long-term producers, then the Canaanites would also have better fruit crops, even though they didn't worship Jehovah. The Israelites, on the other hand, while receiving a better fruit crop, would also receive spiritual blessing from Jehovah because their motives for doing what they did were correct. And in my example, the Canaanites just wanted more fruit, and so they're going to do whatever it took. Get it? Israel sought to be obedient to God, and the result was abundant. They both did the same things as regards the fruit trees, but Israel received God's blessings. Canaanites didn't. Why? Motive. So it is that we at times can see the most greedy, unkind, ungodly people have what appears to be great success and great lives, often by following, unbeknownst to them, scriptural principles of business and stewardship. But that's not the same thing as receiving God's blessing. It is God's blessing we ought to be seeking, because often what appears to be prosperity and abundance is simply fool's gold. It's the devil's trap. I tell you this because it adds another small piece of the puzzle to understanding the principle of humans having an evil inclination and a good inclination residing within us. Doing what seems to be good is not good if the motivation is wrong. Good people who do good things but don't know God are actually doing evil in God's eyes. This is because their motive is not God-directed. It's self-directed. And this is why it is so important to have Yeshua as our Lord. Because the only way that even our good inclinations can be properly channeled and directed and guided is by Him. Without Him, even our attempts at good become evil. Without Him, our motives are by default wrong. Verse 26 repeats the law that a Hebrew shouldn't eat anything with its blood. Simply don't drink animal blood or make food out of animal blood. And this is also necessitated that an animal be killed and its flesh prepared in a certain way. Its blood was to be fully drained from the meat. But please remember that this law about blood means much more than only being prohibited from eating animal blood. How, where, and why an animal is killed is also part of the picture. As of this time, here in Leviticus, the only place that a domestic animal could be killed for any reason was at the tabernacle, at the altar, even if the intent was for meat as food. Later on in the same verse, the rule against practicing divination, fortune telling, was repeated. That is, don't practice magic. But as we find all throughout the Old Testament, the Hebrews were drawn like a moth to a flame to the occult by the evil inclinations that lurked within them. And they were severely disciplined by Jehovah for such things. Invariably, the purpose of divination and fortune telling is what? To know the future. Everybody wants to know the future. And Israel's neighbors, as did all known cultures of that era, made abundant use of the occult. Knowing the future has always been something mankind lusts after. God, however, says He will provide what part of the future He wants us to know by means of His prophets. But all in all, God's prophets provided very little new information for Israel. When God didn't speak to the people through His prophets, then the people were expected to proceed in faith and by following God's clearly defined laws and principles that were set down on Mount Sinai. They had received direction. We believers are to do the same thing. We only occasionally get a direct answer to a direct problem from the Holy Spirit. Far more often, we are to keep going forward in faith while referring to the unchanging scriptures for that direction that we're looking for. Even though it would seem a whole lot easier if God would just tell us what to do. Next, still in verse 26, is the injunction against rounding the hair at the temples of your head, or tearing out the hair of your beard, or gashing oneself as a mourning practice, or getting tattooed. Now, all these things were standard Canaanite cultural norms. In fact, we need to keep in mind that most of the prohibitions we're going to find in the law are there to combat some pagan practice or some pagan nation or another. That is, these aren't theoretical. These aren't hypothetical issues that God is bringing up and addressing. These things were occurring. God wanted the Hebrews, His set-apart people, to avoid them. Now, verse 29 is a little bit different than it appears. It says, don't defile your daughter by making her a prostitute, and this so the land won't fall into prostitution. What this is referring to is religious prostitution, which was another standard Canaanite practice. In other words, a man was not to offer his daughter to a priest for a religious ceremony that involved sex acts, nor was he to sell his daughter for general prostitution in order to obtain money to buy a sacrificial animal to sacrifice at the Holy Tabernacle. Now, the warning is that if Israel drifts into ceremonial prostitution, then the promised land is going to fall into depravity. Now, I've mentioned on occasion that in God's eyes, the land is connected with the people who occupy the land. The people and the land are organically intertwined. So often in the scriptures, as it is here, the term land refers to the place and the people as one complete entity. Now, notice that immediately following this prohibition against sacred sex, God says, keep my Sabbaths and revere my sanctuary. The Hebrew literary structure is a way of indicating to avoid the one but do the other. So the idea is, don't offer religious sex as a misguided way to honor me. Instead, you want to honor me? Observe my Sabbaths. Have the utmost respect for the tabernacle. And by the way, Israel did all of these things against God and more, which is why they were eventually expelled from the land and scattered throughout the earth. The prohibition of verse 31 is to avoid spirit mediums and sorcerers. Some translations say to avoid familiar spirits or ghosts. The idea here is to not attempt communication with the spirits of the dead. So what are we to make of this? Is communication with the dead even possible? Well, the Bible tells us precious little about what happens after death. The Old Testament says almost nothing on the subject. As I mentioned on several occasions, there is no concept of dying and going to heaven in the Torah or anywhere in the Old Testament. It doesn't exist there. It's not as though the Hebrews didn't wonder about death, didn't worry about what was going to happen after they went into their graves. Just like all humans, they were and we are concerned with death and what lies thereafter. But we need to be very cautious that just because God warns his people against hiring mediums and sorcerers to conjure up the spirits of the dead, this is not an indication that ghosts, in the sense of ghosts being the spirits of dead persons, are real. Rather, the problem from a spiritual standpoint seems to be that a person who believes they can contact the spirit of the dead winds up actually communicating with a demon that's doing Satan's bidding. It's kind of a bait and switch play by Satan. And a demon is not, I repeat, a demon is not the spirit of a dead person. A demon, according to my best understanding of the Bible, is a created being who was formerly an angel of heaven, who fell from grace due to their loyalty to Satan's rebellion. And since that day, that means the number of demons has been fixed at whatever number followed Satan at that time. They don't increase and they don't decrease. The subject of death and the spirits of the dead is enormous. Suffice it to say, the beliefs on this, even within the Hebrew culture, evolved and morphed and were never completely uniform any more, frankly, than afterlife beliefs are universal within Christianity. I want to take sufficient time to sum this up because not only is the subject interesting, but it's also pertinent to our faith, to our understanding of what comes after physical death, what comes next. So we'll talk about that next week. Okay? Would you rise, please? Bow your heads. And be ready to be blessed by the Lord. Yevarecha Adonai ve'yishmerecha. Yair Adonai panav alecha ve'chunecha. Visha Adonai panav alecha ve'yasem lecha shalom. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you. Be gracious unto you The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and grant you peace. In the name of the Prince of Peace, Yeshua HaMashiach. And all God's people said.